"Sir, my mother has a ring exactly like yours." The coffee pot kept tilting in her hand. He did not move. He did not blink. He simply stopped breathing. The diner smelled of burnt sugar, industrial bleach, and old grease, a scent Gabriel Costa usually avoided at all costs. But tonight, it was the only place open on a stretch of highway that did not ask questions and did not care what time a man walked in with blood dried under his thumbnail. He sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, facing the door, the way he always sat, the way 12 years of living inside other men's grudges had trained him to sit. Tonight the diner held only a truck driver asleep in the corner booth with his cap over his eyes, and a waitress who looked like she was running on fumes, spite, and the last cup of coffee she had allowed herself 2 hours ago. Gabriel was 34 years old, though the last 48 hours had aged him closer to 50. There was a faint crescent of dried blood under his left thumbnail. He noticed it, frowned at it the way another man might frown at a stain on a good shirt, and scraped it clean with the corner of a paper napkin. The world he ran required order. It required precision, timing, silence, and above all, it required cleanliness, because filth was a language, and Gabriel had learned a long time ago never to let his hands speak for him. He did not want a drink tonight. He wanted 5 quiet minutes in a place where no one knew his name. Gabriel Costa was not a large man in the way people expected criminals to be large. He stood just under 6 feet, lean rather than bulky, his shoulders carrying the coiled tension of a man who had spent more nights than he could count sleeping in a chair rather than a bed. His hair was cropped close, threaded through with the first faint traces of gray at the temples that had arrived far earlier than they should have for a man of 34, a gift, he sometimes thought bitterly, from 12 years of a job that aged a person in dog years. He wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars, and a wedding band that was not a wedding band at all, though strangers assumed it was, and he let them, because the truth of what it actually represented was a story he told no one. His coat, damp from a light rain 3 towns back, still smelled faintly of the docks, of diesel and salt water, and the particular mildew that clung to warehouse concrete, no matter how many times it was scrubbed. He counted exits out of habit rather than fear. 2 doors, the front, and a service entrance behind the kitchen he had clocked the moment he walked in. 1 window large enough to climb through if it came to that, behind the counter, painted shut, useless in a real emergency, but he cataloged it anyway because cataloging was the only thing that had ever kept him alive this long. He drank his coffee black because sugar dulled his attention, and cream soured too fast in a place like this, small details that had stopped being choices years ago and had simply become the architecture of how he moved through the world. Across the room, Chloe Mercer shifted her weight off her left foot and winced as her orthopedic shoe let out a small rubber squeak against the linoleum. She was 25, though the fluorescent lighting and the double shifts had drawn a set of sharp, cynical lines around her mouth that did not belong on a face that young. She did not care about the man in the expensive wool coat sitting alone in her section at 2 in the morning. In her experience, rich men in cheap diners after midnight were one of 3 things: lost, drunk, or hiding. She was not paid enough to guess which. She wanted to wipe the counters, flip the sign to closed, and get home in time to check whether her mother had remembered to eat dinner. She grabbed the glass coffee pot off the burner, the handle warm and familiar in her palm, and crossed to his booth, with her face arranged into the practiced mask of polite exhaustion that every waitress in America wears after 11 p.m. "Warm you up?" she asked. Her voice had gone slightly raspy from hours of repeating the same 4 words to strangers who barely looked at her. Gabriel did not look up. He simply nudged the thick ceramic mug an inch toward the edge of the table. "Please," he said. She tipped the pot. The dark liquid rose steadily toward the rim, and as it climbed her gaze drifted. the way a tired mind wanders toward the nearest strange thing in a room. His hands were large, the knuckles slightly swollen and freshly bruised, but it was the ring on his right index finger that caught her. It was not a delicate piece of jewelry. It was a heavy, crude block of dull gold stamped with an unusual crest. A set of scales badly unbalanced, one side sunk lower than the other, with a jagged fracture running straight through the center of the metal like a scar that had never properly healed. It looked ancient. It looked deliberately broken, as if someone, somewhere, had wanted the imperfection to mean something. Her exhausted brain, running on autopilot, bypassed the filter that usually kept her opinions to herself. "Sir," she said, her tone flat and conversational, the way you might comment on the weather, "my mother has a ring exactly like yours." Gabriel went still. Not the flinch of surprise, not the sharp inhale of shock. Something colder. His entire body simply stopped, the way a held breath stops, the way a held breath can stop a heart if it goes on long enough. His eyes, dark and flat as river stones, rose slowly from the table and fixed on her face with an intensity that made the small hairs along her arm rise before she understood why. She did not notice at first. She was watching the cup. The coffee reached the brim and a few drops spilled over onto the table. "Whoa," she muttered, pulling the pot back. "Sorry about that. Long night." Gabriel kept staring. When his voice finally came, it was dangerously soft, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders in rooms where nobody dared speak out of turn. "What did you say?" She blinked, stepped back half a pace, suddenly aware of how little space separated them in the booth. "I said, I'm sorry. I'll get a rag." Before that, his hand flattened on the table. The gold caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in a dull, ugly shine. "What did you say about this ring?" It was not a question. It was a command dressed up as one. Her defenses snapped up. She had dealt with plenty of strange men on the graveyard shift, but the cold intensity radiating off this one made her stomach tighten in a way the others never had. "Nothing," she said. "Just a stupid observation. My mom's got a ring with that same broken scale thing on it. Keeps it in an old cigar box. Had it since I was a kid. Forget I said anything." She turned to leave. His hand shot out, not toward her wrist. He knew better than to make that kind of scene, but flat against the edge of the table, the knuckles whitening under the pressure. "Wait," he said. He forced the muscles in his jaw to loosen and manufactured a smile that never reached his eyes. "Sorry. It's a custom piece. A family heirloom. I didn't think there were any others." She studied him for a long beat, unconvinced. "Guess your jeweler made two, then," she said, and walked away, her spine deliberately straight, disappearing through the swinging door into the kitchen. Gabriel sat alone in the booth. The silence inside his own skull was louder than anything in the room. There were only ever 3 rings like his. One sat on his own finger. One had been buried in the ground with his father. The third belonged to the man who had wired a car bomb under his older brother's Cadillac 12 years ago and vanished into the wind before the flames had finished climbing. He reached into his coat, laid a crisp $100 bill over the small brown puddle of spilled coffee, and slid out of the booth. At the counter, taped beside a laminated shift schedule, was a handwritten list of employee names. Shift 2, Chloe M. He walked out into the wet night air. It did not touch him. The past he had spent a decade hunting had just poured him a cup of coffee, and it had a daughter's face. The black SUV idled with a low, predatory hum in the alley across the street. Gabriel sat in the passenger seat, the window cracked just enough to let in the mineral smell of coming rain. Behind the wheel, Dean watched the diner's front window with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that most of life's disasters could be avoided by simply waiting 1 extra minute before reacting. "You're telling me," Dean said, his voice a low gravel rumble, "that out of every greasy spoon in this state you walked into the one where the waitress knows about the scale." "She didn't just know about it," Gabriel said, eyes fixed on the diner's back door. "She said her mother has it." Dean's thumb stopped tapping the wheel. "Thomas Vance's ring." Gabriel said nothing. He did not need to. Thomas Vance was more ghost story than man inside the Costa organization. the trusted lieutenant who had rigged the explosives under Leo Costa's car and disappeared before the smoke cleared. Gabriel had spent the better part of his 20s tearing through Vance's known associates, his safe houses, his bank accounts, his old girlfriends, and found nothing. The man had evaporated as thoroughly as a bad dream. If Vance is her father, Dean began, already doing the math out loud. She said her mother had it, Gabriel interrupted, rubbing his eyes as the fatigue of the last 2 days finally settled behind them like a fist. Vance didn't have a wife. He didn't have kids. We tore his whole life apart. There was no woman. People hide things, Dean said, especially guys who know they're about to turn rat. Gabriel turned the heavy gold band on his finger, watching the streetlight catch the fracture in the metal. I want you to dig, he said. Her name is Chloe M. Works the graveyard shift here. Find her last name. Find where she lives. Find everything you can about her mother. And if the mother is Vance's widow, find out where she's keeping his corpse or where he's hiding. Across town, Chloe fought her sticking deadbolt with a hard shove of her shoulder until the door finally gave and stepped into the familiar smell of antiseptic wipes and stale chamomile tea that had come to mean home. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and kicked off her squeaking shoes, sighing as the pressure released from blistered heels that had walked 11 miles between 2 jobs that day. Mom, she called softly into the dim living room, lit only by the flicker of a muted television. Evelyn Mercer sat in a worn floral armchair, 52 years old though illness had hollowed her cheeks and turned her once dark hair a uniform silver. She was watching an infomercial with the vague, unfocused attention of someone who was not really watching anything at all. Chloe, she said without turning. You're late. The bus, Mom. Chloe crossed the room, tucked a blanket over her mother's shoulders, and checked the pill organizer on the side table. Tuesday's compartment was empty. Good, she had remembered. I made $50 in tips tonight, Chloe said, forcing warmth into her voice. We can get the good groceries tomorrow. Maybe that salmon you like. Evelyn's eyes suddenly sharpened, a clarity that always unsettled Chloe more than the fog did. Did you lock the deadbolt? Yes, Mom. The chain, Chloe. Lock the chain. Evelyn's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. They come when it's quiet, when you think the shift is over. Nobody's coming, Mom. We're on the 4th floor in the middle of nowhere. We're safe. To placate her, Chloe walked back and slid the chain into place. On her way to her room, she paused at the hallway bookshelf, where a rusted metal cigar box sat on the bottom shelf, home to a handful of old photographs, 2 birth certificates, and a heavy gold ring. She lifted the ring and turned it slowly in her palm. It felt colder than the room around it. She traced the crack running through the engraved scales and thought of the stranger from the diner. The dead flat eyes, the way his entire body had gone still like an animal catching a scent on the wind. I didn't think there were any others, he had said. Chloe had grown up poor, which had taught her, if nothing else, to be observant. Men in tailored coats with bruised knuckles did not sit alone in roadside diners at 2 in the morning because they were upstanding citizens. They did not wear heavy custom rings as a fashion statement. Mom, she asked quietly, where did you really get this ring? Evelyn did not answer. She only pulled the blanket tighter around herself, shivering in a room that was not cold. By 4 the next afternoon, Gabriel Costa knew exactly who Chloe Mercer was. He sat behind the heavy oak desk in his study, the sky outside bruised purple with the tail end of the storm, staring at the folder Dean had just placed in front of him. Chloe Mercer, Dean recited, hands clasped behind his back. 25. No criminal record. Dropped out of community college 3 years ago. Works the diner at night, bags groceries during the day, buried in medical debt. The mother, Gabriel said, not looking up from a photograph of Chloe walking out of the diner, her face pulled tight against the wind. Evelyn Mercer, Dean said, and this time his tone changed, tightened. This is where it gets strange. Evelyn Mercer did not exist before 24 years ago. No birth certificate under that name. No social security record before 2002. She appeared, rented a cheap apartment, and had a baby. Dean had spent the better part of the day pulling that folder together, and he laid out the process now, the way a man lays out evidence he still does not quite believe himself. He had started with the obvious channels: property records, utility bills, school enrollment forms, expecting Evelyn Mercer to unravel the way every other lead in this business eventually unraveled, a paper trail leading backward to some other name, some other city, some other life she had walked away from. Instead, the trail simply stopped, flat and clean, at a rental application filed in October of 2002 for a studio apartment on the city's north side, first and last month's rent paid in cash, no references listed, no previous address given, the landlord at the time long since dead, and the building itself converted into condominiums a decade ago. There was no earlier Evelyn Mercer anywhere in any database Dean had access to, and Dean had access to databases most federal agents would need a warrant and a favor to touch. Somebody built her a life from scratch, Dean said, tapping the folder. Not a fake name slapped on a stolen social. A real one, clean, aged like it had always existed. That takes money. That takes connections inside places like the DMV, the Social Security Administration, maybe a judge willing to backdate a record. That's not something Thomas Vance could have pulled off running for his life with a bag of cash and 12 hours head start. That's something that takes an organization behind it. Gabriel slowly closed the folder. 2002, the year Vance disappeared, the year his brother died. You think she was Vance's woman, Gabriel said. That he hid her before he ran. It fits, Dean said. He knew the heat was coming. Set her up with a new name, gave her cash, left the ring as a promise he'd come back for her. Only he never did. Or, Gabriel said, his voice flat and cold, he didn't leave it as a promise. He left it as insurance. If she has the ring, she knows what happened to him. She knows where the money went. She knows who he was working for. He stood, buttoning his jacket. Get the car. Earlier that same afternoon, before any of it, Chloe had clocked in at the supermarket on Delancey Avenue for the second half of a split shift, her feet already aching from the diner the night before. She had worked the register for 6 hours, scanning cereal boxes and diapers and lottery tickets under lights that hummed the exact same frequency as the ones at the diner, as though every fluorescent tube in the city had been wired by the same tired electrician. Her manager, a heavyset man named Roy Hensley, who wore a company polo 2 sizes too small, had pulled her aside at 4:15 to inform her that her register had come up $11 short 2 days earlier, and that if it happened again, he would have no choice but to write her up, possibly let her go. Company policy, nothing personal. Chloe had said nothing. She had simply nodded. Because arguing with Roy Hensley cost more energy than she had left to spend, and because a write-up meant nothing next to the fact that her mother's cardiologist appointment the following week would cost $240 out of pocket, money she did not have and would somehow find anyway, the way she always did. She had swiped her badge out at 4:58, walked 6 blocks in the rain because the bus was late, and gone straight to the pawn shop on 4th Street, with a cigar box tucked inside her coat like contraband, hoping for enough cash to cover the appointment, and knowing, even as she pushed open the door, that she was about to give away the only real inheritance her mother had ever managed to hold on to. Gabriel, meanwhile, had built an empire out of exactly this kind of desperation, though he had never once thought of it that way until the moment he watched Chloe Mercer flinch at the mention of a pawn shop that had turned her away. He had grown up the younger of 2 brothers in a house on the hill above the eastern docks, a house with marble floors and a wine cellar, and a father who believed that love and fear were the same muscle and simply needed to be flexed in different directions depending on the day. Leo, 4 years older, had been the golden one, the heir apparent, quick with numbers and quicker with people, the kind of man who remembered the names of dock workers' children and sent flowers when someone's mother passed. Gabriel had spent his childhood in his brother's shadow and had never once resented it, because Leo had also been the only person in that cold marble house who ever made Gabriel feel like more than a spare part waiting to be useful. When their father died of a heart attack at his desk at 58, Leo had taken the reins gently, trying to steer the family's docks and warehouses toward something resembling a legitimate future, cutting ties with the more violent corners of the business one contract at a time. Raymond, their father's younger brother, had smiled through every one of those meetings and said nothing. And Gabriel, 22 years old and still learning which fork to use at which dinner, had never once suspected that his uncle's silence was the sound of a man counting the days. The bomb had gone off on a Tuesday morning outside a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Harbor Authority building, where Leo had been due to meet with a state senator about a shipping contract that would have moved 40% of the family's revenue permanently into daylight. Gabriel had been 11 minutes away, arguing with a supplier over the price of diesel, when his phone rang and a voice he did not recognize told him his brother was gone. He remembered almost nothing about the funeral except the rain and his uncle's hand on his shoulder, heavy and warm, and, he now understood, entirely rehearsed. For 12 years afterward, Gabriel had run the empire his brother was supposed to run, had built it colder and harder and more efficient than his father or his brother ever could have. Because grief, he had discovered, made an excellent foreman. He had told himself every single year that finding Thomas Vance would be the thing that finally let him breathe again. He had never once considered that the ghost he was chasing had a daughter who poured coffee for tips and flinched at the mention of 11 missing dollars. The broker, a man who usually took anything with a pulse, had glanced through his loupe at the crest, gone pale, and slid it back across the glass counter without a word beyond. "I don't touch cartel markers, kid. Get that out of my shop." Cartel marker. The words had followed her home like a stray dog. Her mother was not just hiding from a bad ex-boyfriend, she was hiding from ghosts with guns. The bell above the door chimed. Gabriel Costa walked in wearing a dark tailored suit, no coat tonight, no tie, looking less exhausted and more focused, more dangerous. Chloe felt a spike of real fear and shoved it down under years of practiced composure. "Back to tip me another 100 for spilling coffee?" she asked, keeping the counter between them. "No," Gabriel said softly. He had left the ring in the car, unwilling to spook her further. "I'm here for pie. Cherry if you have it. We only have apple. It's from yesterday." "Apple's fine." She cut a slice without asking if he wanted it warmed. "Look, mister, if this is about what I said, I was joking. My mom doesn't have a ring. Forget I mentioned it." Gabriel picked up the cheap metal fork and did not eat. "You went to a pawn shop on 4th Street this afternoon. The owner threw you out." The blood drained from her face. Her hand crept toward the panic button hidden beneath the counter's lip. "Don't press it," he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you, Chloe. The ring your mother has belonged to a man who took something very important from my family. I just need to talk to her." "My mother is sick," she said, her voice shaking with sudden fury. "She has dementia. She doesn't remember what she had for breakfast, let alone who gave her a ring 20 years ago. Leave us alone." Gabriel watched the fire in her eyes and felt something unfamiliar move through his chest, a strange, jarring flicker of respect. Most people folded the moment he cornered them. This girl, with her blistered feet and her cheap uniform, was baring her teeth at a wolf. He opened his mouth to answer when the bell above the door chimed violently. The door did not open. It was shoved. 2 men walked in, heavy-set, leather jackets reeking of cigarettes and cheap cologne. They were not customers. They were blunt instruments. "Chloe Mercer," the first one said, already pulling a suppressed pistol from his jacket. "Back door, now." Gabriel moved without thinking. He grabbed the heavy ceramic coffee pot off the burner and hurled it into the first man's face. Glass shattered, boiling liquid exploding across his eyes as he screamed and dropped the gun. The second raised his weapon, but Gabriel had already closed the distance, twisted the man's wrist until it snapped, and drove a knee into his ribs. Both men collapsed onto the linoleum, groaning under the steady drip of coffee falling from the ceiling tiles. Gabriel straightened his jacket, stepped over the wreckage, and gently wiped a stray drop of coffee from the counter near Chloe's shaking hand. "Like I said," he told her, ignoring the carnage between them, "I'm not here to hurt you, but those men are, and if they found you here, they've already found your mother." He grabbed her elbow and pulled her toward the back exit before she could argue. snatching her canvas tote off its hook on the way. The alley outside was cold and wet. A black SUV idling 50 feet away, its rear door already swinging open. "Get in," Gabriel ordered. "I don't know you," Chloe said, backing against the brick. "I'm not getting in a car with a man who just broke someone's arm over cherry pie." "Those men were professionals, Chloe. They didn't come to rob the register. They came to put a bullet in your head. And then they were going to drive to your apartment and do the same to your mother. Get in the car." She thought of Evelyn alone in the floral armchair, entirely defenseless, and dove into the back seat. The drive was a blur of streaked neon and hammering rain. Chloe gave Dean the address in a voice that shook with every word, her hands buried in the pockets of her apron. Gabriel wiped blood from his knuckles with a dark cloth beside her, the smell of iron mixing with wet wool and leather. "Who are you?" she finally asked. "Gabriel Costa," he said. "The man who gave your mother that ring murdered my brother 12 years ago." The SUV skidded to a stop outside a crumbling brick apartment building, its streetlight burned out, the structure looking like a rotted tooth in the block's jawline. They took the stairs, 2 at a time. On the 4th-floor landing, Chloe stopped dead. Her apartment door hung ajar, the wood around the deadbolt splintered, the security chain severed clean by bolt cutters. Gabriel drew a matte black pistol and moved with terrifying silence, clearing the living room, the kitchen, both empty. Chloe's breath caught in her throat until a faint, rhythmic scraping sound drew Gabriel's attention toward the bathroom. He nudged the cracked door open with 2 fingers. Wedged between the toilet and the bathtub, knees pulled to her chest, was Evelyn, gripping a rusted garden trowel and dragging its edge across the tile in a slow, steady tick, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Mom!" Chloe cried, dropping to her knees. "They didn't knock," Evelyn muttered, her voice hollow, drifting from someplace 20 years in the past. "Thomas said they would knock. They just broke the wood." Gabriel lowered his weapon, jaw tight. They had not found her. Her paranoia, cultivated over 2 decades of hiding, had saved her life. But they would come back. "Pack a bag," he said. 3 minutes. "We are not staying here." The safe house sat 2 hours north of the city, a brutalist structure of concrete and glass buried in dense pine, ringed by high fences and thermal cameras, its steel doors locking with a magnetic clunk that seemed to vibrate through the floor. While a doctor named Eris checked Evelyn's vitals down the hall, Chloe sat at the kitchen island, still wearing her stained apron, looking like a casualty of a war she had not known she was fighting. "Who's paying for the doctor?" she asked when Gabriel slid a glass of water across the counter. "I am. I don't want your money. I'll sign an IOU. I can pick up extra shifts." "You aren't going back to the supermarket, Chloe," he said quietly. "You aren't going back to the diner. The life you had yesterday ended the second those men walked through the door. You don't get to decide that," she snapped. He laid out the math instead of arguing. The men at the diner were cheap muscle hired through a shell company, but whoever ordered the hit knew exactly who she was, knew Evelyn was a fake name, knew her mother had been hiding Thomas Vance and had kept a piece of him behind. Thomas, he told her, had stolen $5 million from his family before planting the bomb that killed his brother and vanishing for 12 years, and no one had ever known there was a woman and a child left behind. "If you're so powerful," she demanded, "how did a waitress and a sick woman slip through the cracks?" It was a fair question, and it was the same one gnawing at Gabriel's own gut since Dean had handed him the folder. He did not answer right away. Instead, he pulled out the stool across from her and sat down, which surprised her more than anything he had said all night. Men like him, she had assumed, did not sit across from waitresses. They stood over them, or they walked away from them, but they did not lower themselves to eye level and wait. "Tell me about her," Gabriel said. "Your mother. Before the dementia." Chloe wrapped both hands around the water glass, not drinking it, just holding it for the small comfort of something solid. "She worked 2 jobs my whole childhood," Chloe said. "Cleaned offices at night, did alterations during the day. She sewed my Halloween costumes out of curtain fabric because we couldn't afford the store kind, and she made them better than the store kind anyway. She never once told me who my father was. I used to think it was because she was ashamed of him." Chloe let out a short, humorless breath, Turns out she was protecting me from him. We moved 4 times before I turned 10, she went on. Different cities, different names on the mailbox for a while, though she always kept Mercer for us eventually. She always paid in cash. She never let me have a school picture taken after the 3rd move. I used to think she was just paranoid, overprotective. I resented her for it when I was a teenager, wanted normal things, a yearbook photo, a landline with our real last name on the caller ID. She caught herself, surprised at how much she was saying to a man she had known for barely a day. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because no one's asked you in a long time, Gabriel said quietly. It wasn't a question. Chloe studied him, the hard line of his jaw softened for once by something that looked almost like understanding. What about you? She asked. What was your family like before all this? Gabriel turned the water glass a slow half-circle on the counter. My brother taught me how to tie a tie when I was 9, he said. He used to let me ride in the front seat of his car, even though our father said I was too young. He wanted to get us out of the life our father built, wanted contracts instead of debts owed in blood. He was better than all of us. Gabriel's voice did not waver, but something behind his eyes did. I spent 12 years hunting the man who killed him. I never once thought to ask why a loyal soldier would suddenly turn on the family that raised him. I was so certain it was betrayal that I never considered it might have been a leash held by someone standing right next to me the whole time. You still don't know for certain, Chloe said. No, Gabriel admitted, not yet. But the ledger will tell me, your mother's box will tell me. He looked at her, and for a moment the predator in his eyes gave way to something almost apologetic. I'm sorry that finding those answers means dragging you and your mother through the wreckage of a war you had nothing to do with. Chloe was quiet for a long moment. Downstairs, the low hum of the safe house's ventilation system was the only sound in the kitchen. My mother used to say that the truth doesn't care whose life it wrecks on the way out, Chloe finally said. It just comes out eventually, whether you're ready or not. Maybe it's better it comes out now with someone standing next to us than 20 years from now when I'm alone and it finds me anyway. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, the exhausted waitress with dish soap still under her fingernails, and felt something shift and settle in his chest that had not moved in 12 years. It's not going to be safe, he said. Not for a while. I told you, Chloe said, managing a thin, tired smile. I'm used to the dark. Later, alone in the hallway outside her door, Gabriel allowed himself to think about the things he had not said out loud at the kitchen island. He thought about the medical bills stacked in a shoebox under Chloe's bed, which Dean had photographed during a surveillance pass 2 days earlier without her knowledge. $41,000 in unpaid hospital invoices dating back to a stroke Evelyn had suffered 2 years prior, invoices that had been sold twice to different collection agencies, each one adding its own fees and its own threatening letters that Chloe had learned to recognize by the color of the envelope and throw straight into the recycling bin unopened, because opening them changed nothing except her blood pressure. He thought about the way she had stood between 2 armed men, and a stranger she owed nothing to, not because she was brave the way soldiers were brave, but because she had simply never learned any other way to exist in the world except upright. He also thought, with a coldness that unsettled even him, about his uncle's face at Leo's funeral, the warm hand on his shoulder, the quiet words about legacy and duty that Gabriel had carried like scripture for 12 years. He tried to remember a single moment in that entire decade when Raymond had ever once offered a real lead, a contact, a rumor about Thomas Vance. He could not find one. Every trail Gabriel had chased alone had gone cold on its own, and every time it did, Raymond had been there afterward with a drink and a reminder that some ghosts simply could not be caught, that a man had to learn to live with unfinished business or it would eat him alive. Gabriel had spent 12 years believing his uncle was teaching him patience. He was beginning to suspect his uncle had simply been keeping him leashed to a grief that would never resolve, because a nephew consumed by an unsolvable hunt was a nephew who never looked too closely at anything else. The Costa organization did not miss things. It owned police records, bank databases, half a dozen judges. Evelyn Mercer should not have been able to vanish for 20 years without help. Someone on the inside had scrubbed her from the map, and until tonight, Gabriel had never once let himself wonder who. That night, after Chloe finally went to sleep in the room at the end of the hall, Gabriel's phone rang. Dean's voice crackled through, tense in a way Gabriel rarely heard from him. The men at the diner had no ID, burner phones only, but the car they arrived in was not stolen. The plates traced to a shell company their own accountant had set up 3 years earlier. The hit had not come from a ghost outside the family. It had come from inside the house. Morning broke pale and gray over the safe house, the pine trees outside the bulletproof windows still dripping from the storm. Gabriel had not slept. He sat in the fortified study, staring at a corkboard of old photographs, financial ledgers, and a grainy surveillance photo of Thomas Vance, taken a week before the explosion. Evelyn appeared in the doorway wearing an oversized sweater Chloe had packed for her silver hair brushed, her eyes unnervingly clear. She crossed to the corkboard and studied the photo of Thomas without a flicker of fear. "He always hated having his picture taken," she murmured. "Said it stole a piece of your soul. I told him he didn't have one left to steal." "You're the Costa boy," she said, turning to study Gabriel's face. "The younger one, Leo's brother." He felt a cold spike run through his chest. He had never introduced himself. "You remember me?" "I remember the funeral," she said softly. "I stood across the street in the rain. I watched you cry. You were just a kid. You look like him now." "The angry one. Thomas killed my brother, Evelyn." "I know," she said without apology, only the blunt weight of a survivor's truth. "He came home that night covered in drywall dust and engine oil, told me he did what he had to do to get us out, said the Costas would kill him anyway. He was a rat." Evelyn spat back at nothing. "He sold us out for a payday," Gabriel said, old hatred flaring hot in his chest. "You really believe that?" Evelyn said, a sad knowing smile touching her lips. "After all this time, you think Thomas was the mastermind? He was a dog, Gabriel, loyal, vicious. But he never held the leash." Before Gabriel could press her further, Chloe rushed into the doorway, breathless, panicked, at finding her mother's bed empty. Evelyn calmed instantly under her daughter's hand, then turned back to Gabriel with sudden, startling authority. "The box," she said. "The rusted one. Ask her for it." Hesitantly, Chloe pulled the cigar box from her tote and set it on the desk. Inside were old Polaroids, a birth certificate, and the ring, a perfect match to the one Gabriel had locked away at his estate. He turned the empty box over in his hands and noticed its bottom sat higher than the corners suggested it should. He wedged a pocket knife into the seam and pried a false bottom loose, revealing a small black leather notebook, its cover dry and cracking. Gabriel opened it. The room went very quiet. Even Evelyn, drifting somewhere between past and present, seemed to sense the shift and stopped wandering toward the bookshelf. Inside were columns of numbers, routing codes, offshore accounts, dates, a shadow ledger, meticulous and patient, the work of a man documenting a betrayal in real time. Gabriel turned a page, then another. His thumb slowed. It was not written in Thomas Vance's crude, blocky hand. That much was obvious within the first line. The script was elegant, slanted, unhurried, the kind of handwriting a man practiced for decades until it became a signature of its own. Gabriel had seen that exact handwriting on birthday cards, on the margins of legal contracts, on the back of a photograph taken at his own christening. He knew it before he let himself know it. He kept turning pages anyway, because some part of him needed to see the last entry with his own eyes before he would believe what his gut had already told him 3 pages ago. The last entry was dated the day before the car bomb killed Leo. Payment cleared. T takes the fall. The kid inherits the throne. "Who wrote that?" Chloe asked, watching the color drain from a face she had never seen anything but perfectly composed. "My uncle," Gabriel whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He ordered the hit on my brother." Raymond Costa had stood beside Gabriel in the rain at Leo's funeral, one hand resting on his nephew's shoulder, teaching him in the years that followed how to shoot, how to negotiate, how to lead. It had never been mentorship. It had been the shaping of a weapon Raymond could steer from behind the throne, while Gabriel spent 12 years hunting a ghost that had been paid to disappear. Gabriel called Dean into the study, ordered Evelyn return to her room, and gave the order to prepare the car for the city. Dean warned him it was a death sentence, that Raymond controlled the eastern docks and half their muscle, but Gabriel had already made his decision. Before he left, Chloe stopped him at the desk, refusing the emergency key and cash she tried to press into her hand, and instead led him to the kitchen sink to clean the split, bleeding knuckles he had earned protecting her. For the first time in 12 years, something in his chest loosened under her hands. The rain in the city had turned torrential by the time the SUV pulled up outside the Velvet Room, Raymond's mahogany sanctuary in the Eastern District. Gabriel checked his watch before stepping out of the car. 4:17 in the morning. Raymond kept the club open until dawn on Thursdays, a habit of 30 years that Gabriel now understood had never been about the scotch. It had been about visibility, about being seen exactly where he said he would be. A man with nothing to hide standing very still, while everything he had built ran on hidden currents underneath him. Gabriel walked through the brass doors past 2 disarmed guards and found his uncle, exactly where he expected, seated by an unlit fireplace with a glass of scotch. 60 years old, with a head of thick silver hair and the warm, crinkled eyes of a man who looked far more like a retired banker than the architect of a murder. A single lamp burned beside him. The rest of the club sat in shadow, mahogany walls swallowing what little light there was. "I heard about the mess at the diner," Raymond said calmly, not even glancing up from his glass. "Sloppy. You shouldn't be out in the open, Gabriel. Not with the family still unsettled." "Thomas had a daughter," Gabriel said, and watched something behind his uncle's warm eyes go briefly, unmistakably cold, there and gone again so fast that a lesser man might have missed it. Gabriel had spent 12 years learning to read that exact flicker in other men's faces. He did not miss it now. "Thomas is dead, Gabriel. We buried that ghost 12 years ago." Raymond finally looked up. "Whoever this girl is, she's trying to extort you. People come out of the woodwork the moment they smell money. Her mother is Evelyn Mercer," Gabriel continued, his voice utterly flat, each word set down like a stone. "She kept a rusted cigar box on a bookshelf for 2 decades. Inside it was a ring." He reached into his coat and set the heavy gold band on the small table beside Raymond's glass. It landed with a single dull clink that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the empty club. Raymond looked at the ring, at the broken scales, and for one fraction of a second the warmth in his eyes hardened into something reptilian. "A piece of jewelry proves nothing," he said softly, and reached for his glass with a hand that was not quite as steady as it had been a moment ago. "It wasn't just the ring, Uncle," Gabriel said, and the word uncle came out sounding like something spat rather than spoken. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out the black leather notebook, holding it up so the low lamplight caught the cracked spine. "He kept the ledger, he kept the routing numbers, and he kept the final entry. Payment cleared. T takes the fall. The kid inherits the throne." The silence that followed felt like the inside of a held breath. Somewhere behind the bar, glass touched glass. And then even that sound stopped. The bartender, understanding without being told exactly what kind of room he had just found himself standing in, and choosing, wisely, to disappear through the kitchen door without a word. Raymond set his glass down with exaggerated care, as though the gesture alone might buy him another minute. He did not deny it, he did not beg. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, a small, habitual vanity that Gabriel had watched his uncle perform 1,000 times across 1,000 negotiations, and Gabriel understood in that instant that Raymond was not stalling out of fear. He was stalling because some part of him still believed he could talk his way out of this, the way he had talked his way out of everything else for 30 years. "Leo was weak," Raymond said, the soothing baritone gone now, replaced by something harsher, more pragmatic. "He had a bleeding heart, Gabriel. He wanted to legitimize the business, pay taxes, sit on charity boards, shake hands with senators who would have turned on us the second it stopped being convenient. He would have driven this family into the ground within 5 years. The wolves would have eaten us alive, and you know it. You've always known it. You just never let yourself say it out loud. So you paid a rat to blow him to pieces, Gabriel said, and raised the gun. His hand, freshly bandaged hours earlier by a woman who owed him nothing, did not shake. I did what had to be done to save this family, Raymond snapped, finally showing his teeth. I chose you, Gabriel. You had the fire. You had the pragmatism your brother never did. Everything you built, everything this family survived, exists because I cleared the path for you. You should be thanking me. You made me a monster, Gabriel said. You were always a monster, Raymond replied, a thin, humorless smile curling at the edge of his mouth. I just gave you a crown. Raymond's hand twitched toward the cushion of his chair, a motion so small most men would never have caught it, but Gabriel had spent his entire adult life watching for exactly that kind of motion in exactly that kind of man. Gabriel fired twice. The suppressed shots barely disturbed the quiet of the room. Raymond slumped back, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt, his mouth working silently before his eyes clouded and fixed on the ceiling. Gabriel stood over the body for a long time, feeling nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness where 12 years of hatred had lived. By the time he returned to the safe house, dawn had begun to bruise the sky purple. Chloe was still sitting at the kitchen island, the money from the safe untouched beside her, her diner apron finally discarded. She saw the blood on his collar and the hollow exhaustion in his shoulders, and told him quietly that she was tired of running, that her mother had spent 20 years hiding behind fake names and dead bolts that never held, and that she would not live that way. Gabriel told her Raymond was dead, that the threat was over, that she could take the money and disappear somewhere safe. She asked him, if she took it, whether she would ever see him again, and the question caught him more off guard than any gun ever had. He admitted he was a dangerous man, that his life left no room for light, that it ruined everything it touched. She stepped closer anyway, brushed a drop of rainwater from his ruined collar, and told him she worked the graveyard shift, that she was used to the dark. For the first time in 12 years, Gabriel Costa did not want to sit facing the door. He just wanted to go home. 6 months later, the city had a new name attached to the docks, and it was not one carved in fear the way Raymond's had been. Gabriel dismantled the parts of his uncle's operation that had trafficked in extortion and blood debts, and quietly folded the legitimate shipping contracts into a company that bore his mother's maiden name instead of his own. He met with federal prosecutors twice, off the record, through an attorney who owed him nothing and understood everything, and handed over enough of Raymond's shadow ledger to sink 4 judges, 2 city councilmen, and a police captain who had been taking envelopes since before Chloe was born. He kept nothing for himself but the truth about his brother. Evelyn Mercer's health did not improve, but her fear finally did. She spent her mornings on a sunlit porch attached to the small house Gabriel bought outside the city, a house with a real deadbolt and a chain she no longer needed to check 3 times before bed, because armed men she trusted, quietly and without fanfare, walked the property line every night. On her good days she gardened. On her bad days, Chloe sat with her and let her talk about a man named Thomas who had, in his own broken and cowardly way, tried to save the only 2 people he had ever loved before he vanished into a grave nobody had ever found, somewhere along the eastern coastline, exactly where the ledger said Raymond had buried him 13 years earlier once his usefulness had run out. Chloe never went back to the diner or the supermarket. She used a portion of the money to pay off $53,000 in medical debt in a single afternoon, standing at a hospital billing counter and watching a clerk's face change when the balance hit 0. With what remained, she opened a small nonprofit out of a storefront 2 blocks from the old Starlight Diner, a resource center for graveyard shift workers and family caregivers who could not afford legal help, medical transport, or a single night of uninterrupted sleep. She named it the Evelyn House. Within a year it had helped file for benefits on behalf of 211 families, secured emergency housing for 34 of them, and put 6 single mothers through a paralegal certificate program funded entirely through the foundation's own small endowment. Gabriel funded it without ever putting his name on a single document, because he understood better than anyone how a name could become a cage. He sat on no board, gave no interviews, and appeared at no ribbon cuttings. But every Thursday evening, when the center closed its doors, a black SUV idled quietly across the street until Chloe locked up and climbed inside. Dean stayed on, not as muscle but as something closer to family, running the legitimate side of the shipping operation with the same blunt efficiency he had once brought to breaking a hitman's wrist. He married a woman he met at Evelyn's church 2 years later and asked Gabriel, half joking, half not, to be the best man. Gabriel said yes before Dean finished the sentence. 2 years after the night in the Velvet Room, the Costa docks moved more legitimate freight than they ever had under Raymond, employed 47 people who had never once been asked to carry a gun, and had not seen a single mysterious fire, a single unexplained disappearance, or a single envelope pass beneath a table. The old guard who had once served Raymond either left quietly with severance and a warning, or did not leave quietly at all, and those cases were handled by the same federal prosecutors who had once been handed a leather notebook and a stack of routing numbers by a man who never gave his real name. Evelyn passed peacefully in her sleep on a warm spring morning, 18 months after moving into the house with the good deadbolt, her hand still holding the rusted cigar box, empty now except for the photographs and the ring, which Chloe kept afterward, not out of superstition, but because it had, in its strange, broken way, brought her the 2 most important people in her life. She buried her mother beside a small stone marker that read simply, Evelyn, beloved mother, finally home, and Gabriel stood beside her the entire service without once letting go of her hand. They married the following autumn in the backyard of the house outside the city, a small gathering, no press, no photographs sold to anyone, just Dean as best man, a dozen employees from the Evelyn house, and a minister who had no idea he was marrying a man who once ran half the eastern docks. The yard had been strung with simple white lights, nothing elaborate, because both of them had privately agreed, without ever quite saying it out loud, that elaborate had never once kept either of them safe and simple finally could. Dean's wife baked the cake herself, a lopsided 3-tier vanilla that Dean joked afterward tasted better than anything either of them had eaten in the private dining rooms Raymond used to favor. And for once, Gabriel laughed without checking the exits first. Chloe wore her mother's ring on a thin gold chain around her neck instead of her finger, close enough to feel against her skin, far enough to never again be mistaken for a target. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the yard stayed perfectly silent, except for the wind moving through the pines at the edge of the property, the same pines that had once stood guard over a safe house full of fear, now simply standing guard over an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Gabriel slid a plain gold band onto Chloe's finger, nothing crested, nothing broken, nothing that carried the weight of 30 years of blood beneath its surface, and understood as he did it that he had finally, after everything, given her a ring that meant only one thing instead of 3. The pawnbroker on 4th Street, the same man who had once slid the ring back across his counter and told Chloe to get it out of his shop, was among the first people Gabriel quietly compensated once the dust settled, not out of guilt, but out of a strange, private sense of accounting. The man had been right to be afraid of a cartel marker. He simply had not understood that the family behind it would eventually choose to bury its own violence rather than let it keep spreading. Gabriel never told him why an envelope with $15,000 in it arrived at his shop with no return address, but the broker retired to Florida 18 months later and never asked. Dr. Eris continued to treat Evelyn until the end, and afterward accepted a permanent position overseeing medical care for every family the Evelyn house assisted, a role that let him practice the kind of medicine he had gone to school for in the first place, the kind that asked no questions and demanded no envelopes. Roy Hensley, the supermarket manager who had once threatened to write Chloe up over $11 missing, was quietly and legally investigated 8 months later after an anonymous tip led auditors to a pattern of skimmed register funds that had nothing to do with any of his employees, and least of all with Chloe, whose name was formally cleared in a letter she framed and hung in the reception area of the Evelyn house as a small private joke that only she and Gabriel understood. The security camera from the diner, the one that had captured grainy footage of two armed men storming the counter and a man in a wet suit jacket breaking one of their arms, was never turned over to police. Instead, it became Exhibit A in a sealed federal affidavit that helped convict 3 former Costa lieutenants on racketeering charges 11 months after Raymond's death, men who had once answered only to him and had never learned to answer to anyone honest. The mysterious witness Dean had once worried about, an old dock worker named Samuel Otero, who had loaded crates for the family for 30 years and quietly kept his own ledger of every shipment that never should have existed, came forward on his own 2 years later, no longer afraid of a man who could no longer hurt him, and testified in exchange for nothing but a pension the family had owed him for a decade. By the 3rd year, the Evelyn house had expanded into a second location on the west side of the city, employing 4 full-time caseworkers, all of them former graveyard shift workers themselves, and had helped secure over $400,000 in emergency medical grants for families who would otherwise have chosen between rent and a hospital bill. A local news station ran a short segment about the center's anonymous funding, calling it one of the city's best-kept philanthropic secrets, and Chloe smiled through the entire interview and gave nothing away, because some promises were worth keeping even after the danger that created them had gone. Gabriel Costa never went back to sitting in a booth with his eyes locked on the door. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, what it meant to sit with his back exposed in a room full of people who loved him and meant him no harm. It did not come naturally. Some nights the old instinct still pulled his gaze toward every exit in a restaurant before he could stop it. But there was a hand that found his under the table now, every single time, and it was enough to remind him that the war really was over, and that somewhere in the wreckage of his own family, he had found something worth protecting that did not require a single bullet. Years later, Chloe would sometimes take the ring off its chain on quiet evenings and turn it over in her palm the way she had done as a girl in a cramped apartment hallway, tracing the crack in the broken scales, and think about how close she had come to selling it for a fraction of what it was worth to a pawnbroker who had recognized it faster than she ever could have. She thought about how her mother had carried that ring through 4 cities and 2 decades of fear, not because Thomas Vance had asked her to keep a promise, but because some buried instinct in a frightened, pregnant woman had understood that the truth she was holding on to might someday matter more than her own safety. Evelyn had never lived to see the ledger close the case against the men who had hunted her for 20 years, but she had lived long enough to see her daughter stop running, and in the end, that was the only ending she had ever truly wanted. What would you have done, sitting in that booth, if a stranger's daughter had accidentally handed you the key to your own family's darkest secret? Would you have walked away to protect yourself, or would you have followed the truth into a fire you could not control? Gabriel chose the fire, and it cost him the only family he thought he had, but it gave him the one he actually needed. How far would you go to protect the people who never asked to be caught in your war? And when the truth finally comes looking for you, quietly, over a cup of coffee at 2 in the morning, will you have the courage to let it in? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes that the truth is worth the cost of finding it, and leave a comment telling us which moment stayed with you the longest. Sometimes the people who save us are not the ones we expected, and sometimes the family we build is stronger than the one we were born into.